Get off, now! Not a request, more like a king banishing a peasant. Captain Sterling, face like granite, blocked her aisle. Flight 402, JFK to London, suddenly a stage for his personal drama. He figured she was a seat switcher, a nobody daring to breathe first-class air. Arrogant fool. What he couldn't see, what simmered beneath her quiet gaze, was a storm about to break. He thought those tailored slacks and that iPad were a costume. He had no idea, no clue that her calm was the eye of a hurricane that would rip his sky apart. He was about to learn a lesson, the hard way. A kindness repaid with brutal justice. They all were. He was dead wrong. In less than 45 minutes, the man who ruled the clouds would be begging for his job, stripped of his wings and humiliated by the very fraud he tried to remove. This isn't just a story about a bad pilot. It's a story about the kind of karma that doesn't just hit. It destroys. Captain Richard Sterling adjusted his tie in the reflection of the terminal window, admiring the sharp jawline that had grayed just enough to give him an air of seasoned authority. At 54, Sterling wasn't just a pilot for Horizon Apex Airlines. In his mind, he was the airline. He had flown everything from Cessnas to the massive Boeing 777-300ER sitting at the gate today. He demanded perfection, absolute obedience from his crew, and an exclusivity in his cabin that bordered on obsession. To Sterling, first class wasn't just a seating assignment, it was a sanctuary for the elite. He despised the way the airline had started offering upgrades to common tourists using credit card points. He believed the front of the plane belonged to captains of industry, politicians, and old money. People who looked like him. People who acted like him. "Weather looks choppy over the Atlantic, Captain," his first officer Darian Hensley said, looking up from the flight plan on his iPad. Darian was 30, competent, but timid. He knew Sterling's reputation. You didn't correct Sterling, and you certainly didn't annoy him before coffee. "I'll handle the Atlantic, Darian. You just worry about the radio," Sterling snapped, grabbing his cap. "I'm going to do a cabin walk. The gate agents have been letting all sorts of riffraff slip through lately. I want to make sure the cabin is up to standard before we push back." Sterling marched down the jet bridge, the heavy humidity of a rainy New York afternoon clinging to the air. He entered the aircraft, nodding curtly to Sarah, the lead flight attendant. Sarah was young, only 2 years into the job, and terrified of Sterling. He had written her up 3 months ago for wearing a shade of lipstick he deemed distracting. "Boarding is nearly complete, Captain," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "First class is fully booked." "Is it now?" Sterling muttered, his eyes scanning the plush leather seats. He saw the usual suspects. In 2A, a tech CEO in a hoodie, typing furiously. In 3F, an elderly oil tycoon he recognized from previous flights. But then his eyes stopped at 1A. Sitting in the most prestigious seat on the plane was a woman Sterling didn't recognize. She was a black woman, perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blazer and dark slacks. She had an iPad propped up on the tray table and was reviewing complex schematics, her stylus moving rhythmically across the screen. Her hair was styled in neat professional locks, and she wore gold-rimmed glasses that caught the light. She didn't look like a celebrity. She didn't look like a senator's wife. To Sterling's prejudiced eye, she looked like someone who had gotten lost on her way to economy comfort. Sterling felt that familiar prickle of irritation. He hated when gate agents made mistakes. It disrupted his schedule. He walked over, his boots heavy on the carpet, and stopped directly beside seat 1A. He loomed there for a moment, waiting for her to acknowledge him. She didn't. She continued working, engrossed in the digital blueprints in front of her. "Excuse me," Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave to that command tone he used on unruly passengers. The woman paused. She looked up, removing her glasses. Her eyes were calm, dark, and intelligent. "Yes, Captain?" "I think you're in the wrong seat," Sterling said, skipping the pleasantries. "Economy boarding is through the second aisle, past the galley." The woman blinked, a faint, confused smile touching her lips. "I'm aware of where economy is, Captain. However, I'm seated here. 1A. "Let me see your boarding pass," Sterling demanded, holding out his hand. He didn't ask, he ordered. The woman's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of weary patience. She tapped her phone screen and held it up. "Dr. Naomi Clark, Seat 1A, JFK to LHR. Sterling glanced at the screen. It looked legitimate, but his mind rejected the data. Dr. Naomi Clark. Probably a doctorate in art history or something equally useless, he thought. Or maybe the system had glitched. Horizon Apex's booking algorithm had been acting up all week. There was no way this woman paid $12,000 for a last-minute ticket. Digital passes can be easily forged, Sterling scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. I need to see the paper ticket issued at the counter. Or your ID. I used the app, Captain. I didn't go to the counter. And I've already been cleared by TSA and the gate agent, Naomi said, her voice steady but firm. Is there a problem? The problem, Sterling leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear, is that we have a very strict manifest for this flight. High-value clients. I don't recall seeing a Clark on the VIP list this morning. I was a late addition, Naomi replied. Now, if you don't mind, I have work to review before takeoff. She went to put her glasses back on. That dismissal, that refusal to be intimidated, snapped something in Sterling. He wasn't just a pilot, he was the authority. He reached out and placed his hand over her iPad screen, blocking her view. The cabin went silent. The tech CEO in 2A stopped typing. Sarah, the flight attendant, gasped audibly from the galley. I don't think you hear me, Sterling hissed. I don't care what app you have. I know how the system works. People buy cheap economy tickets and try to sneak up front while the crew is busy. I've seen it a dozen times. Now grab your bag and move back to row 45 where you belong, or I'll have you escorted off the plane entirely. Naomi Clark looked at the heavy, calloused hand covering her work. Then she looked up at Sterling. The warmth was completely gone from her eyes. Remove your hand from my personal property, she said. It wasn't a shout, but the authority in her voice was sharper than Sterling's stripes. And check your manifest again, carefully. I don't need to check anything. Sterling straightened up, his face reddening. Sarah, get security on the line. We have a non-compliant passenger attempting ticket fraud. Sarah Jenkins froze in the galley. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She had seen Dr. Clark's boarding pass when she offered her a pre-flight champagne. The system had flagged Dr. Clark as a Priority Global Services member, the highest possible tier, usually reserved for board members or individuals who flew more than 200,000 miles a year. Captain, Sarah whispered, stepping forward tentatively. I checked her pass earlier. The system says she's… I don't care what the glitchy iPad says, Sarah, Sterling barked, spinning around to face his subordinate. Look at her. Does she look like she bought a full-fare first-class ticket on a Tuesday afternoon? It's a system error. And I'm not flying with a security risk who lies about her seat. He turned back to Naomi, who hadn't moved an inch. Last chance, Sterling said, pointing toward the economy curtain. Naomi slowly closed her iPad cover. She stood up. She was tall, nearly eye-level with Sterling in her heels. She smoothed her blazer. You are making a mistake, Captain Sterling, she said clearly. A career-ending mistake. Is that a threat? Sterling laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. You're threatening the captain of the vessel? That's a federal offense, lady. You just upgraded yourself from moved to economy to arrested. He grabbed his radio. Ops, this is Captain Sterling on Flight 402. I need airport police to the gate immediately. I have a passenger refusing captain's orders and making verbal threats. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from awkward to hostile. The other passengers began to murmur. Hey, the tech CEO in 2A spoke up. She wasn't threatening you. She just said you were making a mistake. And honestly, man, you're being incredibly aggressive. Sterling whipped his head around. Stay out of this, sir, unless you want to deplane too. This is a matter of aviation safety. Safety? Naomi asked, raising an eyebrow. My presence in this seat endangers the flight. Dishonesty endangers the flight, Sterling retorted. If you lie about a seat, what else are you lying about? Luggage, weapons. At that moment, Darian Hensley, the first officer, poked his head out of the cockpit. He looked pale. He had been listening to the exchange and had decided to check the detailed manifest on the flight computer, the internal one that showed more than just names. Captain, Darian said urgently, stepping into the cabin. Captain, can I talk to you for a second? In the cockpit. Not now, Darian. I'm waiting for the police. Sterling waved him off. Rick, seriously, Darian pressed, using the captain's first name, which was strictly forbidden. You need to look at who she is. The code next to her name is— I don't care about the code, Sterling shouted, losing his composure completely. The stress of his divorce, the recent union negotiations, and his inherent bias all boiled over into this one moment. He needed to win. He needed to be right. I am the captain. I decide who flies. Two heavy-set Port Authority police officers walked onto the plane, their radios crackling. What seems to be the problem, Captain? The lead officer asked. This woman, Sterling pointed a finger directly at Naomi's face, is refusing a direct order to vacate a seat she did not pay for. She is disrupting the pre-flight sequence and has threatened me. I want her removed. The officer looked at Naomi. He saw a calm, well-dressed woman standing with her hands clasped. He looked back at the red-faced, shouting pilot. Ma'am, the officer asked politely. Is this true? I have a valid ticket, officer, Naomi said, her voice cool as ice water. Captain Sterling refused to inspect it properly. He assumed, based on my appearance, that I could not possibly afford this seat. He then accused me of fraud and deemed me a security risk. It's not about appearance, Sterling lied, though sweat was beading on his forehead. It's about protocol. Ma'am, to keep the peace, maybe we can sort this out at the podium, the officer suggested, trying to be diplomatic. No, a deep voice rumbled from the back of the first-class cabin. Everyone turned. In seat 4F, a man who had been asleep, or pretending to be, was now sitting up. He was an older gentleman with silver hair, wearing a slightly rumpled linen suit. He had been watching the entire interaction over the top of a newspaper. She isn't going anywhere, the man said. He stood up. He wasn't tall, but he carried a gravity that sucked the air out of the room. And neither is this plane, apparently. Sit down, sir, Sterling snapped. This doesn't concern you. Oh, it concerns me very much, Richard, the man said, using Sterling's full first name. Sterling squinted. He didn't recognize the passenger. And who are you? Sterling demanded. The man walked slowly up the aisle. He didn't look at the police. He looked directly at Naomi and gave her a respectful nod. Then he turned to Sterling. My name is Elias Prentice, the man said softly. Sterling froze. The blood drained from his face so fast it left him dizzy. Elias Prentice. The name was legendary. He wasn't just a board member. Elias Prentice was the chief operating officer of Horizon Apex Airlines. He was the man who signed the checks. He was the man who signed the firing orders. He rarely flew commercial, and when he did, he usually flew private or incognito to audit the crews. Mr. Prentice, Sterling stammered, his posture collapsing. I didn't know you were on board. I was handling a security anomaly. You weren't handling a security anomaly, Prentice said, his voice deadly calm. You were harassing a guest, and not just any guest. Prentice gestured to Naomi. Captain Sterling, have you actually looked at the flight parameters for today? Do you know why we are flying a Boeing 777-300ER to London for maintenance instead of a standard passenger rotation? It's a scheduled check, Sterling mumbled. It's a scheduled check because of a recurring hydraulic vibration in the landing gear assembly that our mechanics can't isolate, Prentice said, a vibration that could be catastrophic if not fixed. Prentice turned to Naomi. Officers, you can stand down. This woman is Dr. Naomi Clark. She is the lead aerospace engineer for Boeing's safety division. I personally hired her to fly with us today to diagnose the vibration in mid-air. She isn't just a passenger, Captain Sterling. Prentice leaned in close to Sterling's face. She is the only reason this plane is allowed to take off today. She is technically your boss for the duration of this flight. The silence in the cabin was heavy, heavier than the jet fuel laden in the wings. Captain Richard Sterling stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking from the furious eyes of his COO, Elias Prentice, to the calm, impenetrable face of Dr. Naomi Clark. The police officers looked at each other, sensing the shift in the wind. The lead officer cleared his throat, breaking the tension. So, I take it there's no arrest to be made here, Mr. Prentice? The officer asked, hooking his thumb in his belt. No, officers. Thank you for your time, Prentice said, his eyes never leaving Sterling. Our captain made a grievous error in judgment. one that we will be discussing in detail once we are on the ground in London." The officers nodded and shuffled off the plane, casting one last confused look at Sterling, who now looked less like a king and more like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test. Once the police were gone, Prentice stepped closer to Sterling. He didn't yell. He spoke in a low, dangerous register that terrified the flight crew more than any shouting match could have. "Richard, get back in the cockpit," Prentice ordered. "You are going to fly this plane, and you are going to do it perfectly. And Dr. Clark—" Prentice turned to Naomi, his demeanor softening instantly into professional respect. "Dr. Clark needs access to the jump seat for takeoff and landing to monitor the sensor arrays. She will be in the cockpit with you." Sterling's head snapped up. "Excuse me? Sir, that's against protocol. No civilians in the cockpit during sterile flight rules." "She isn't a civilian, Richard," Prentice snapped, his patience finally snapping. "She is a contracted specialist for Horizon Apex. She has higher clearance than you do. Now, either you invite her into your cockpit and treat her with the utmost respect, or you hand your stripes to Darian right now, walk off this plane, and check your email for your termination letter." Sterling felt the walls closing in. He looked at the passengers. The tech CEO was smirking. Sarah, the flight attendant, was looking at the floor to hide her satisfaction. He had no choice. He had 3 ex-wives and a mortgage on a boat he couldn't afford. He needed this job. "Fine," Sterling spat out, the word tasting like bile. He turned to Naomi, unable to look her in the eye. "Follow me." He turned on his heel and marched toward the cockpit, not waiting to see if she followed. Naomi picked up her bag. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk at the passengers who were now looking at her with awe. She simply nodded to Elias Prentice. "Thank you, Mr. Prentice. I'll have the preliminary data for you within the hour." "Thank you, Doctor." "I'm truly sorry," Prentice replied. Naomi walked past the galley and entered the cockpit. It was a tight space, illuminated by the glow of the instrument panels. Darian Hensley, the first officer, was already strapped in. He looked up, his eyes wide with apology. "Dr. Clark," Darian said, extending a hand as best he could from his seat. "I'm Darian. I just want to say I'm really sorry about back there. I tried to tell him." Naomi took his hand firmly. "I know you did, Darian. I appreciate it. Let's just get this bird in the air." She set up her equipment quickly. She pulled a specialized laptop from her bag and connected it to a port under the main console, a port that most pilots didn't even know existed. It tapped directly into the aircraft's central nervous system, bypassing the flight computer's filtered display to show the raw data from the hydraulic lines. Sterling sat in the captain's seat, aggressively flipping switches and punching coordinates into the flight management system. He was trying to reclaim his domain. He put on his headset, pointedly ignoring the woman sitting 3 feet behind him. "Pre-flight check," Sterling barked at Darian. "Flaps. Set 15. Trim. Set. APU? Running." Sterling worked with a furious speed, trying to prove his competence. "I am the best pilot in this fleet," he told himself. "She's just some affirmative action hire engineer who thinks she knows flying because she can read a blueprint. I'll show her what real flying is." "Gate services, we are ready for pushback," Sterling radioed, his voice tight. As the massive engines spooled up, whining into a high-pitched roar, Naomi watched the lines of code scrolling on her screen. She wasn't looking at the scenery, she was looking at the pressure variance in the hydraulic line leading to the elevator actuators. 0.4% variance, she noted mentally. Within limits, but high for a plane sitting still. "Horizon 402, you are cleared for takeoff." "Runway 31L, the tower crackled. "Cleared for takeoff, Horizon 402, Sterling replied. He shoved the throttles forward, the G-force pressed them back into their seats. The runway lights blurred into streaks of white. Sterling rotated the yoke, and the heavy aircraft lifted off the ground, climbing steeply into the grey overcast sky over New York. For a moment, the grace of flight took over. The noise settled into a steady hum. They broke through the clouds into the blinding sunlight of the upper atmosphere. Sterling engaged the autopilot and finally turned around to look at Naomi. He had a smug grin on his face. "Smooth enough for you, Doctor?" he asked, dripping with sarcasm. "Or did you detect a vibration that messed up your little computer game?" Naomi didn't look up from her screen. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard. The takeoff was within standard parameters, Captain, she said neutrally. However, your rudder input was a little heavy at 140 knots. You compensated for a crosswind that wasn't there. Sterling's face went purple. Darian let out a small, choked cough to hide a laugh. I felt the wind, Sterling lied. You can't feel the plane through a laptop. That's the problem with you engineers. No instinct, just numbers. Numbers don't lie, Captain, Naomi said, finally looking him in the eye. People do, and right now the numbers are telling me that the vibration Mr. Prentice is worried about isn't in the landing gear. It's in the vertical stabilizer. The tail, Sterling scoffed. The tail is fine. The controls are responsive. Don't invent problems just to justify your paycheck. I'm not inventing anything. There is a harmonic resonance building in the hydraulic fluid. It's faint, but it's there. If we hit turbulence, that pressure is going to spike. We're at cruising altitude, Sterling dismissed her, turning back to the window. Smooth sailing all the way to London. Just sit there and be quiet until we land. He had no idea that he had just tempted fate in the worst possible way. 2 hours into the flight, the atmosphere in the cockpit was toxic. Sterling had spent the last 100 minutes making snide comments about diversity hires and complaining about the state of the airline industry to Darian, intentionally loud enough for Naomi to hear. Naomi ignored him. She was watching a red line on her graph slowly inching upward. The harmonic resonance wasn't stabilizing, it was amplifying. Captain, Naomi spoke up, her voice urgent. I'm seeing a pressure spike in the center hydraulic system. We need to descend to a lower altitude to reduce the stress on the airframe. Sterling ripped off his headset. Are you flying this plane? No, I am. All my gauges are green, see? He tapped the glass display of the ECAS, engine indication and crew alerting system. Green, 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 everything is normal. The sensor I'm reading is downstream from the cockpit gauges, Naomi explained, trying to keep her cool. Your gauges are averaging the data. My sensor is reading the raw input. The valve is fluttering. If it sticks, you lose the rudder. I'm not descending, Sterling said stubbornly. We have a tailwind up here. I'm making up time. If I drop to 28,000 feet, we burn more fuel and arrive late. I'm not explaining a delay to Prentice because you got nervous. Rick, Darian said, looking at Naomi's screen, maybe we should listen. She designed the system. Shut up, Darian, Sterling snapped. Suddenly the plane jolted. It wasn't the rhythmic bump of normal turbulence, it was a sharp lateral kick, like the tail had been shoved sideways by a giant hand. The coffee in Sterling's cup splashed onto the console. What was that? Darian asked, grabbing the yoke. Just clear air turbulence, Sterling said, though his voice wavered. Autopilot is compensating. Bam! A second jolt, much harder this time. The nose of the plane yawed viciously to the right. The autopilot disconnected with a screaming wail. Cavalry charge alarm. Autopilot disengaged, Darian yelled. Yaw damper failure. Sterling grabbed the controls. I have control. He tried to correct the yaw with the rudder pedals, but they felt mushy. He stomped on the left pedal to straighten the nose, but the plane barely responded. They were drifting sideways at 500 miles per hour, putting immense aerodynamic stress on the wings. We're losing heading, Sterling shouted, sweat instantly popping out on his forehead. Why isn't it responding? The actuator is jammed. Naomi unbuckled her belt and leaned forward, grabbing the back of the center console to steady herself against the violent shaking of the cockpit. Captain, stop fighting the rudder. You're forcing fluid into a blocked line. You're going to blow the seal. I need to straighten the plane, Sterling roared, panic setting in. He slammed his foot on the pedal again. Pop. A sound like a gunshot rang out through the floorboards. Instantly, the hydraulic system's C-pressure low light flashed red on the dashboard. We lost System C, Darian screamed. Hydraulic fluid is gone. I told you, Naomi yelled, her professional mask slipping just enough to show her anger. You blew the seal. Now you have no rudder control and limited elevator authority. The plane began to bank dangerously. The loss of hydraulic pressure meant the heavy flight control surfaces were now flapping in the wind, unresponsive. The nose dipped, and the massive Boeing 777 began to descend in a spiral. In the cabin, screams erupted. The passengers were pinned to their seats by the G-forces. Elias Prentice, sitting in 4F, gripped the armrests, knowing exactly what was happening. and knowing Sterling had ignored the warning. Back in the cockpit, Sterling froze. It was a phenomenon known as cognitive lock. Faced with a situation that contradicted his reality, his brain simply shut down. He stared at the spinning altimeter, unable to process the emergency checklist. Rick, what do we do?" Darian yelled, looking at his captain. Sterling said nothing. He was hyperventilating. "Captain Sterling," Naomi shouted, shaking his shoulder, "snap out of it." He didn't move. He was a passenger in his own seat. "Darian, take the controls," Naomi ordered, taking command. "Disconnect the auto throttle. We need to steer with differential thrust." Darian hesitated. "But the captain..." "The captain is incapacitated by panic," Naomi barked. "I am the lead engineer of this aircraft's safety division. Do it, or we die." Darian nodded, adrenaline clarifying his mind. "I have controls." "Okay, listen to me," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a calm, hypnotic cadence amidst the chaos of alarms. "The rudder is dead. The elevators are sluggish. We are banking right. Increase thrust on the right engine, reduce on the left. Gently, 5% differential." Darian adjusted the throttles. The roar of the right engine increased. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose stopped swinging right and began to pull back to center. "Good," Naomi said, her eyes glued to the attitude indicator. "Now, we can't pull up with the yoke. The elevators won't have enough pressure. We need to use pitch trim. Use the electric trim switches. Nose up. Short bursts." Darian thumbed the switch on his yoke. Click, 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 click. The nose of the plane, which had been pointed down at the ocean, slowly began to rise. The altimeter stopped unwinding. They leveled off at 22,000 feet. The cockpit was filled with the sound of alarms, but the violent shaking had stopped. They were flying, but barely. Sterling blinked, slowly coming back to reality. He looked at his hands, which were trembling uncontrollably in his lap. He looked at Darian flying the plane. Then he looked at Naomi, who was leaning over Darian's shoulder, guiding him through the most complex failure mode the aircraft could experience. Sterling croaked. "I have..." "You touch those controls, Sterling, and I will break your fingers," Naomi said. She didn't look at him. She was focused entirely on saving the 300 souls on board. "You froze. You nearly killed us. You are done. Sit on your hands and don't make a sound." Sterling slumped back. The realization hit him harder than the turbulence. He hadn't just been rude. He hadn't just been racist. He had been incompetent. And the woman he tried to kick off the plane was currently the only thing keeping it in the sky. "Darian," Naomi said, "we can't cross the Atlantic like this. We need to divert. Boston is behind us, but Halifax is closer. Do we have the charts for Halifax?" "Yes," Darian said, his voice steady now that he had direction. "Halifax Stanfield. Runway 23 is the longest." "Okay," Naomi said. "This is going to be a hard landing. We have no speed brakes and only partial flaps. We're going to come in fast. I need you to calculate the approach speed, adding 40 knots. "Captain," Darian said, addressing Sterling out of habit, then stopping. He turned to Naomi. "Doctor, can you handle the radio? I need to focus on flying." "I'm on it," Naomi said. She grabbed the headset Sterling had discarded. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." Naomi's voice went out over the frequency, clear and authoritative. "Horizon 402, heavy. We have experienced a catastrophic failure of hydraulic system center. Flight controls degraded, requesting immediate diversion to Halifax. Souls on board 312. Horizon 402, Halifax Center copies Mayday," the controller replied instantly. "Vectoring you for runway 23, emergency services are rolling. What is the nature of the difficulty?" "Pilot incapacitation," Naomi said, glancing at the broken man in the left seat. "And structural failure. We are flying on differential thrust." Sterling closed his eyes. He heard it. Pilot incapacitation. It was the death knell of his career. But as the plane shuddered again, he realized that if they didn't pull off this landing, it would be the death knell of his life. The coast of Nova Scotia appeared through the windshield as a jagged grey line against the darker grey of the ocean. The weather in Halifax was deteriorating, low cloud ceiling, mist, and a stiff crosswind coming off the Atlantic. For a fully functional aircraft, this would be a routine instrument approach. For Horizon Flight 402, cripplingly wounded and flying on backup systems, it was a gauntlet. Inside the cockpit, the noise was deafening. The slipstream roared against the fuselage, louder than usual because the plane was flying in a slight crab angle due to the asymmetrical thrust. Every alarm that could be blaring was blaring. "Distance to runway threshold 20 miles, Naomi called out. She was monitoring the radar altimeter and the navigation display, feeding Darian the data he couldn't spare the mental energy to look for. "Speed is 260 knots. That's too fast, Darian." "I can't slow down yet." Darian grit his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes. His hands were white-knuckled on the throttle levers. "If I drop the speed now without flaps, we'll stall. I have to carry the speed until we're over the concrete." Sterling sat in the left seat, a ghost of a man. The paralysis of his earlier panic had faded, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization of his own impotence. He watched Darian, the kid he had bullied for 2 years, handle the massive jet with a finesse Sterling had lost years ago. He watched Naomi, the woman he had deemed a fraud, calculate glide slopes in her head with the precision of a computer. "You're coming in too hot," Sterling mumbled, his voice cracking. "You're going to overrun." "Quiet," Naomi snapped, not even looking up. "Darian, listen to me. The crosswind is from the left at 18 knots. Since we don't have a rudder to crab into the wind, you're going to drift right. You need to aim for the left edge of the runway. Let the wind push you to the center." "Understood," Darian breathed, aiming left. "Gear down," Naomi ordered. Darian reached for the lever. "Gear down." The heavy landing gear dropped with a thud. The extra drag instantly slowed the plane, but it also destabilized it. The nose pitched down violently. Trim up," Naomi yelled. Darian thumbed the electric trim switch, fighting the yoke. The nose groaned back up. 3 miles, runway in sight," Darian said. His voice was trembling. "Oh God, it looks short." The runway lights of Halifax Stanfield pierced the mist. To Darian, they looked like a tiny strip of tape in a vast ocean of darkness. "You have this, Darian," Naomi said, her voice softening. She reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Focus on the numbers. Speed 210, descent rate 800. You are right on the glide slope." They crossed the threshold. The ground rushed up to meet them at terrifying speed. Usually a pilot would flare, pull the nose up gently to kiss the tarmac. But without elevator authority, Darian couldn't flare properly. They were going to slam onto the ground. "Brace for impact," Darian yelled into the PA system. Crunch. The main gear hammered into the runway with the force of a car crash. The plane bounced, groaned, and slammed down again. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling in the cabin. Overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage. "Brakes, max braking," Naomi shouted. Darian slammed on the toe brakes, but at 190 knots the brakes were screaming. The anti-skid system chattered violently. "We're drifting right," Darian yelled. The crosswind was pushing them off the center line. "Left engine idle, right engine reverse thrust," Naomi commanded. It was a risky maneuver, using asymmetric reverse thrust to steer on the ground, but they had no choice. Darian yanked the right thrust reverser. The engine roared, pulling the right side of the plane back. The nose swung violently to the left, back toward the center. "Reverse off, brakes." The end of the runway was approaching fast. The red lights indicating the danger zone flashed past. "We're not stopping," Sterling screamed, covering his face. "Stay on it," Naomi yelled. The tires, pushed beyond their limits, gave up. Boom, boom. 2 tires on the left main gear exploded. The metal rim ground into the concrete, sending a shower of sparks trailing behind the plane like a comet's tail. The friction finally did what the brakes couldn't. The massive Boeing 777 shuddered, groaned, and screeched to a halt, 70 feet from the mud at the end of the runway. Silence, absolute ringing silence, filled the cockpit. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of the spinning down avionics and the heavy breathing of the 3 people inside. "Tower," Naomi whispered into the headset, her voice shaking for the first time. "Horizon 402 is down. Secure. Requesting fire crews for hot breaks." "Copy, 402. The tower controller's voice was filled with awe. "Fire trucks are already rolling. Incredible job, Horizon." Darian slumped forward over the yoke, sobbing with relief. Naomi sat back, closing her eyes, letting the adrenaline crash over her. And Sterling? Sterling stared out the window at the fire trucks racing toward them. He saw the reflection of his own face in the glass. He looked old. He looked small. He knew with absolute certainty that he had just flown his last flight. The evacuation was orderly, though chaotic. Firefighters sprayed foam on the smoking landing gear as passengers slid down the emergency chutes. There were minor injuries, bruises, whiplash, a broken wrist, but everyone was alive. Inside the terminal at Halifax, the scene was a frenzy of activity. Canadian authorities, paramedics, and airline representatives were swarming. The passengers were huddled in a holding area, wrapped in blankets, clutching coffees, buzzing with the manic energy of survivors. Elias Prentice, the COO, refused medical attention. He stood by the glass doors of the jet bridge, waiting. He wasn't acting like a passenger anymore, he was the executive in charge. His suit was rumpled, his hair messy, but his eyes were flint. Finally, the flight crew emerged from the customs hall. First came the flight attendants, looking shaken but relieved. Then Darian Hensley, walking with a slight limp from the strain of pressing the pedals, looking exhausted. Then came Captain Richard Sterling. He walked with his head down, his cap in his hand. He looked like a man marching to the gallows. And finally, Dr. Naomi Clark. She had recomposed herself. Her blazer was buttoned, her glasses were back on. She looked remarkably untouched by the near-death experience, except for the tiredness around her eyes. The passengers broke into applause as Darian and Naomi entered the room. The tech CEO stood up and cheered. Sarah, the flight attendant, hugged Darian. Sterling stood alone. No one clapped for him. Elias Prentice walked through the crowd, parting the sea of people. He walked straight past Sterling without even a glance. He went directly to Darian Hensley. "Son," Prentice said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have reviewed the flight data telemetry that Dr. Clark sent during the descent. That was the finest piece of airmanship I have seen in 40 years. Darian stammered, "Thank you, sir. But Dr. Clark talked me through it. I couldn't have done it without her." Prentice turned to Naomi. He didn't offer a handshake. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound respect. "Dr. Clark, Horizon Apex owes you a debt we can never repay. You saved my life. You saved all our lives." "I was just doing my job, Mr. Prentice," Naomi said quietly. "Darian did the heavy lifting." "Now," Prentice's voice hardened. The warmth evaporated from the room. He turned slowly to face Richard Sterling. Sterling flinched as Prentice's gaze landed on him. The room went quiet. The passengers, sensing the shift, stopped their chatter. "Captain Sterling," Prentice said. The title sounded like an insult in his mouth. "Mr. Prentice, Sterling began, his voice wheedling. "The turbulence, it was unexpected. The failure, it was a mechanical issue. I did my best to manage the crew in a crisis." "Stop," Prentice said. He held up a hand. "Just stop." Prentice reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I have been on the phone with the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board for the last 20 minutes, Prentice said loud enough for the room to hear. "We have the cockpit voice recorder data. It's already been uploaded." Sterling paled. "Sir, privacy protocols." "You waived your privacy when you endangered my airline," Prentice snapped. "I heard you, Richard. I heard you refuse to listen to the warning signs. I heard you mock Dr. Clark. I heard you freeze." Prentice took a step closer. "But what is most unforgivable," Prentice continued, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "is what happened before we even took off. You tried to remove the one person who could save us because you didn't like the color of her skin. You judged her. You belittled her. You treated a genius engineer like a criminal because of your own pathetic insecurities." Sterling looked around the room. He saw the disgust on the faces of the passengers. He saw the police officers standing by the wall, watching intently. I was following protocol," Sterling whispered weakly. "No," Prentice said, "you were following your prejudice, and it ends today." Prentice reached out. Sterling flinched, thinking he was going to be hit. But Prentice didn't hit him. Instead, he reached for the 4 gold stripes on Sterling's shoulder, the epaulets that signified his rank as captain. Rip. The sound of the Velcro tearing was shockingly loud in the quiet terminal. Prentice ripped the epaulette off the left shoulder, then the right. He held the stripes up. "You are relieved of command, Mr. Sterling, permanently. You are fired for cause, effective immediately. You will not fly for Horizon Apex. You will not fly for anyone. I will personally ensure that your license is revoked for gross negligence and moral turpitude." Sterling stood there, his shoulders bare, his uniform suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He was stripped. "Officers," Prentice nodded to the Canadian Mounties standing by the exit. "Please escort Mr. Sterling out of the terminal. He is no longer crew. He is a trespasser." As the officers moved in to grab Sterling's arms, the former captain looked at Naomi. He looked for pity. He found none. "Dr. Clark," Sterling pleaded, desperation in his voice. Tell him I tried. I landed the plane." Naomi looked at him. She adjusted her glasses. "You were a passenger in that cockpit, Richard," she said comfortably. "Darian landed the plane. You just took up space." The officers hauled him away. The doors slid shut behind him. Prentice turned back to the room. He looked at Darian Hensley. "Darian," Prentice said, reaching out and placing the 4 gold stripes he had taken from Sterling into Darian's hand. "Get these cleaned up. They're yours now." Darian looked at the stripes in his hand, stunned. "Sir?" "Captain Hensley," Prentice corrected him. "You earned them. When we get a replacement plane, you're flying us home." The room erupted in cheers again. But amidst the celebration, Naomi simply packed her bag. She walked over to the window and looked out at the broken plane on the runway. She wasn't interested in the applause. She was already thinking about the hydraulic schematic, wondering how to redesign the valve so this would never happen to anyone else again. 6 months had passed since the incident on Horizon Apex Flight 402. The story had made the rounds in the aviation industry, whispered in crew lounges from Dubai to Denver, but the full details were kept relatively quiet, pending the official investigation. That silence ended today. In a sterile hearing room in Washington, D.C., the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, released its final report. Richard Sterling sat at a small wooden table, wearing a cheap suit that fit poorly, a stark contrast to the tailored uniform he used to wear like armor. He looked 10 years older. His hair had thinned, and his face was puffy from months of drinking away his shame. Across the room sat Elias Prentice, Darian Hensley, and Dr. Naomi Clark. They looked like a united front, a wall of competence that Sterling could not breach. "The findings are conclusive," the chairman of the board stated, tapping a thick stack of papers. The primary cause of the incident was a mechanical failure of the center hydraulic system. However, the board finds that the situation was exacerbated to a near-fatal degree by the pilot in command's failure to adhere to cockpit resource management protocols and his refusal to acknowledge sensor data provided by a qualified expert. The chairman looked over his spectacles at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, your actions during the pre-flight sequence, specifically your harassment of a key technical advisor based on personal bias, created a hostile cockpit environment that directly contributed to your cognitive lock during the emergency. You didn't just fail to fly the plane, you actively tried to sabotage the only person capable of saving it." Sterling leaned into the microphone. "I have flown for 30 years, he rasped, his voice sounding hollow. "I have a perfect record. One bad day shouldn't erase a lifetime of service." "It wasn't a bad day, Richard," Elias Prentice spoke up from the gallery. "It was a revelation of character." The gavel came down. The judgment was swift and brutal. Richard Sterling's airline transport pilot license was permanently revoked. He was barred from holding any safety-sensitive position in aviation. He was grounded, forever. But the karma didn't stop at the courtroom door. Outside, the press was waiting. The story of the racist pilot who nearly crashed a 777 had finally leaked to the tabloids. As Sterling walked down the steps, flashes blinded him. Questions were shouted, questions about his divorce, which had been finalized the week prior, his wife taking the house, his debts, and his humiliation. He tried to push through the crowd, but there was nowhere to go. His reputation was radioactive. No regional airline would touch him. No flight school would hire him to teach. He was a pariah. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, a different scene was unfolding. Darian Hensley, now Captain Hensley, was having lunch with Naomi Clark. Darian looked confident, the timid boy gone, replaced by a man who knew he could handle the worst the sky could throw at him. "You know," Darian said, stirring his coffee, "Horizon just implemented a new training module for all crews. It's called the Clark Protocol. It's about listening to non-traditional sources of information during emergencies." Naomi smiled, taking a sip of her tea. "I heard. Elias sent me the draft. It's a good step." "It's more than a step," Darian said seriously. "It's a culture shift. You changed the airline, Naomi. You didn't just fix a valve. You fixed the mindset." "I just wanted to get to London," Naomi laughed. The final twist of the knife for Sterling came 2 weeks later. He needed a job. Any job. The alimony payments were due and his savings were gone. He applied to a logistics company near JFK Airport. He figured if he couldn't fly the cargo, maybe he could manage the warehouse. The hiring manager, a young black woman named Jessica, looked at his resume. She looked at the name. She paused. "Richard Sterling?" she asked. "Yes," he said, hoping she didn't know. "The pilot." Sterling sighed. "Former pilot?" She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't get angry. She didn't yell. She just looked at him with a mixture of pity and indifference. "We don't have any management positions," she said. "But we are hiring for the shuttle loop." "The shuttle loop?" Sterling asked, horrified. "Driving the employee bus from the parking lot to the terminal," she explained. "It's minimum wage. Take it or leave it." And so the man who once looked down on the world from 35,000 feet, the man who refused to believe a black woman could sit in first class, ended up exactly where his karma demanded. Every morning at 5 a.m., Richard Sterling puts on a polyester vest. He sits in the driver's seat of a rattling bus, and every day he drives flight crews to the terminal. He watches young, diverse captains and engineers, people like Darian, people like Naomi, walk past him, dragging their flight bags, heading to the jets that he is no longer allowed to touch. They don't even notice him. He is just the driver. And as he watches the planes take off, soaring into the clouds he used to rule, he finally understands the lesson he refused to learn. Gravity doesn't care who you are, but karma. Karma always checks the manifest. That is the story of Captain Sterling and the mistake that cost him everything. It's a powerful reminder that prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's actually dangerous. When we let our biases blind us to the talents and value of the people around us, we don't just hurt them, we sabotage ourselves. Sterling thought he was protecting his plane, but he was actually dooming it. It took the person he respected the least to save the life he valued the most. What do you think? Do you think the punishment fit the crime, or did Sterling deserve a second chance? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of justice served, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story about karma hitting back. Thanks for watching and fly safe.